Hey guys, welcome back for another video. So by now you should be able to find assets for your game, create a game, and upload it to the workshop. So for the next step, we're going to do a video that's optional because I know for some of my students, whenever it comes to programming, things can get a little bit more intimidating, but there is no reason to be scared here whatsoever. I promise you it's going to be total fun. Let's have a look at programming in Tabletop Simulator. So welcome to the programming section. Well, actually, it's more like a scripting section because we're not going to do any complicated programming in here. We're mostly just going to see how you can move the objects around in a tabletop simulator room by writing a little bit of code. Nothing too complicated, I promise, but if this is really not your thing, you're more than welcome to skip to the next video. Anyways, to get scripting in Tabletop Simulator, you're going to need a text editor. And the one that's recommended by the makers of Tabletop Simulator is called Atom. It's completely open source. You can find the code for it online if you really want to mess with it. But otherwise, you can just go to atom.io, the website, and download it here for Windows. Or you can look into other platforms if you're a Mac or a Linux user. So once you've got Atom installed and you open it up, it should look somewhat like this. Obviously, I've already been working in Tabletop Simulator, so it already says Tabletop Simulator Lua here, but it might look slightly different for you. In any case, what you want to do is you want to open up Tabletop Simulator and you want to create a new room. So just as we've been doing in the past, just maybe get a rectangular table in there as well, like so. And then you can go back to Atom, and then you go to Packages and Tabletop Simulator, and then you click on Get Lua Scripts. And it'll ask you, you want to get Lua scripts from the game? And you can click on, yeah, get the scripts. And this is what it should look like when you get the scripts in. You have this blue pop-up that says that you received 2 files. And if you open this up, you should have a global #1, probably .ttslua and global.xml. The ttslua files are the files with the code that will make things move in Tabletop Simulator. The XMLs are really not used if you're coding. They have some use, but it's beyond the scope of this video. So you're always looking for the ttslua file in case there's any doubt. So once you get here, you'll see the default page and you'll see function onLoad. A function is basically a set of instructions that you run when something happens. In this case, this function will run whenever the room is being loaded. So any code you put in here will run when the room is loaded. Now, whenever you see these two hyphens, the code is commented out. So if I remove these, the code will get color, which means that the code would run. Now that code has some errors in there that has improper syntax, so that won't work. But it's just coded out there to help you out, really. It's some helpful annotations, if you will, that the makers of Tabletop Simulator put in there. In particular, the top annotation is actually really useful. It tells you if you need some help, check out the documentation, https://api.tabletopsimulator.com. And if you go to that website, you will reach the Tabletop Simulator API. So the API is basically a documentation of all the information that you could possibly need to write your code in Tabletop Simulator. Now, if you look at my web browser here, I am actually not on api.tabletopsimulator.com. I'm at ttscommunity.github.io. Why is that? Well, the community of Tabletop Simulator users have copied over the entire documentation for the Tabletop Simulator API, and they've put them on a GitHub webpage, and it's almost the same documentation, except that sometimes when there are new modifications to Tabletop Simulator, it takes quite some time for developers to update their documentation. The community, however, immediately sees these things, and well, there's lots of people in the community, so they update it almost immediately. So I want you guys to use tts-community.github.io instead of the official one, because this one is more up to date. Anyways, it's something that you'll figure out after a while working by yourself, but it's better to know these things from the get-go. All right, so with that being said, if you read through this, you'll know everything there is to know about the Lua scripting. Lua is the scripting language, just as English is a language if you're not familiar with programming. So if you read through this, you'll learn everything there is about Lua scripting in Tabletop Simulator, but it's a lot of text to read, and it's pretty dense if you're not familiar with it. So I'm going to start by showing you guys a quick example just so you have some idea on how easy it is to make things happen in Tabletop Simulator through code. And then I'll point you in the direction on where you can find more information if you choose to become better at it. So going back to Tabletop Simulator, well, I want to move some stuff around, so I'm going to need a couple of objects. So the first object that I want you guys to bring out is just a deck of cards. A standard deck will do. And, oops, you can select the deck and put it in a place that's convenient for you to work with. Maybe zoom in a little bit. And we're going to give that deck a name, because for code, it's going to be convenient that things have names and it's easy to find them. So if you right click the deck like I just did, you'll see that there's a field there for name and description. And actually, that's a little pro tip that I'm going to give you right away. If you go to black, the game master, and you do the same thing, you'll see that there's also a field called GMNotes. That's actually a third field that is invisible to all users or all players except for the game master. So when you click on name, you can put a name in there and we'll just call it deck. It's just a deck. So that's what we'll call it. But most of the time you want to use a more unique identifier, but this is going to be a very simple tutorial. So I'm not going to put too much different objects in there anyway. So deck will suffice. Then for the second component that I would like for you to bring out, I want you to just bring out a nice red square. And then we're going to mess around a little bit with that square. We're going to grab our gizmo, click on it, and we're going to change the scale a bit because I would rather have a flat rectangle instead of a square. So on the x-axis, we're going to write 6, and that will make it wider, as you can see on screen. And on the z-axis, because if you remember from the previous video, z is not up or down, but it's, well, it's the vertical axis on the two-dimensional plane, not the three-dimensional plane. So there we're going to put maybe 3. That would look good. Yeah, that looks great. And then for the y, the thickness, let's do 0.25 because we want it a little bit thinner. Alrighty, so now we kind of created our own little card, if you will. It's not a playing card by any means, but it's just a little plank. So yeah, and those are the two objects that we're going to use. So what we're going to do now is we're going to games to save and load, and we are going to save our game. And that is kind of important when you're programming. You want to save everything before you start writing code, because what is happening behind the screen is that Tabletop Simulator is communicating with Atom, the text editor, and they are having multiple files, the file of what's in the room versus the file where you write the code, and they need to stay synced up with each other. So you have to be careful that they don't get out of sync, because it's pretty easy to write code and bring in a new object and then write some more code and then save the code, and then it will overwrite the room code and your object will disappear. Anyways, that might sound a little bit cryptic at this point, but just keep in mind, you're gonna have to save whenever you go from the room to the text editor or whenever you go from the text editor to the room. Okay, so we're gonna save the game and we're gonna call this game whatever you like, really. I'll just call it tutorial because that's a quick and easy name. All right, so now we have our room. We go back to Atom, and in Atom, what we could do is we could click on Get Lua Scripts again, which will get all the code, but it should be pretty much the same stuff. It'll receive the 2 coded files and everything pretty much looks the same still. So to make sure that that connection that I was just talking about is working, I'm also going to do Tabletop Simulator Save and Play. Now, alternatively, you can also press Ctrl, Shift, and S, which is what I will be doing most of the time when I'm saving. When you click that button, you'll see that Atom is sending back the files with the code to Tabletop Simulator. And if there's anything in the room that hasn't been saved before, that will get overwritten. So be careful with that. So anyways, we're in our room. Everything is still there because we saved first before we went to our code. And everything's working nicely. So what we are going to do now is we're going to make a button and we're going to put that on our box, because the goal of this tutorial that I want to do is I want to shuffle that deck of cards and I want to deal to all players at the table. I want to deal them all a card by pressing a button. So let's do that. So I'm going to right click on the object that I made, and then I'm going to go to scripting, and you'll see I can click on scripting editor, and there's also GUID with a 6 integer code behind it. The GUID is the unique identifier of the graphical user interface for that specific object. It's the ID for the object. So it's a unique number just to that object. So if in the code I ever type in I want object 439553, the code will know I'm referring to the rectangle here. Anyways, we're not going to use that just yet. We're going to go to the scripting editor first. So I'm just going to click on scripting editor. And if I go back to Atom, you'll see that it now says block square. And the block square has a TTS Lua file and an XML file as well. Again, don't worry about the XML. We're going to write our code in the TTS Lua. So all the code that goes in here is part of that red square that we have. Pretty cool. But what I want to do is I want to spawn a button, something that we can click. So let's go to the API and pretend that I have no idea how to do this, which might be the case for some of you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type createButton just to see if we get lucky. And well, you see member variable summary, get buttons, classic UI, create button. Well, let's click on create button, see what happens. So we go to a page now that says create button, and it says creates a scripted button attached to an object. Scripted buttons are buttons that can be clicked while in game that trigger a function in a script. That sounds pretty sweet. So if we scroll down a little bit, we actually get a nice little code example and everything. So what I'm going to do here is just pretend I don't know anything about coding in Lua. I'm going to copy that with Ctrl+C, and I'm going to paste that in the block square TTS Lua file. Function onLoad, all that stuff, and then function clickfunc and other stuff. All right. I don't know if this will work at all if I press it, and I think chances are it won't. So I'm going to change a couple of things just to make sure that we're going to see this if we send this back to Tabletop Simulator. So the first thing that I want to do is I'll go over all the items briefly to the extent that you need to know them. So the click function is the function that will run whenever you click the button in Tabletop Simulator. How do I know this? Well, in the API documentation, it literally says that here. Parameters click function, it's a string of the function name that will be run when the button is clicked. Now, I'm not going to explain everything in minute detail. If you want to learn more of the basics of coding, we have other classes for that. But in general, whatever you put in click function, you want to put there the name of a function that you put somewhere else as well. So here we got function clickfunc, because whenever you click on the button, this is what will happen. It will redirect to the code that you put in here. So that's how that works. We can call it clickfunc, but just to show you how it works, you can change it to whatever you like. And since this button is going to deal some cards, I'm just going to call the function deal cards. All right. Next, the function owner is self. So the owner of the function will be the red rectangle. I'm fine with that. The label is what text will be on the button. So I'm going to call the label deal cards because that's what the button will do. And then the position. So this is relative to wherever that rectangle is positioned in the room. I want to make sure that I can see it because if I put it at 0, 0, it's going to be in the middle of the rectangle and it might be below the surface so we can't see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it pop out a little bit. I'm going to write here 5. So now it's going to hover 5 units above the red rectangle. We'll see if that works. If it doesn't, we'll figure it out soon enough. Is there other stuff in here? I mean, I think everything else kind of makes sense probably. I mean, rotation, width, height are all pretty common English terms. The color is, well, color is denoted in most programming languages as RGB values, red, green, blue. So it's like mixing paint. So it's how much red do you want to use, how much green do you want to use, and how much blue do you want to use. And since it's 0.5 on all of these values, you're going to get some gray because we're going to do half red, half, or 1/3 red, 1/3 green, and 1/3 blue. The font color is going to be white, and there's a tooltip which we could just as well delete because who needs it right now? And then the function called self-create_button, which is the title of the function, which you can find in here. So that was what we were looking for. So whenever you type create button, it will create that script and it needs all this information before. So params here is actually all that information in here. And in the API documentation, it explains why all this stuff is needed. Anyways, bear with me. I'm gonna press Ctrl, Shift, and S. And maybe we'll get an error, maybe we won't. But it's sending 3 files and it updated all of them. So we're back in Tabletop Simulators and lo and behold, there is some text on my button now, if on my rectangle, and if I hover over it, it actually feels like a button because it gets a little darker. And when I click it, we see a lot of text pop up in here. I'll explain why that's happening in a second. But first we probably want to fix the graphics because this looks really ugly. So why is it looking so ugly? Well, that's because we have been messing around with the model, the red cube. We've scaled it on the X and the Y value, or the X and the Z value, and that same scale applies to whatever button you make. It's just a quirky thing of Tabletop Simulator, and well, you're gonna have to get used to a lot of quirkiness if you're working with Tabletop Simulator scripting. But anyways, it's easy to fix that. So because if we click on the rectangle again, we can see that the scale is 6, 0.25, and 3. So if we go to the code, and well, we could see if there's a way to scale that button. And if we look at the API, it says, yeah, parameter scale of the button. Great, let's use that. So I'm gonna add a little bit of code now. I'm just gonna write scale equals to, and this is the same as it is in the gizmo. So it starts with the X value. So our object is pretty much 6, 0.253. Now, since we've scaled it by 6, 0.25 in thickness, and then 3 on the Z value, we kind of want to do the opposite and get it back to where we used to be. So to do that, we want to divide it by 6, so 1 over 6, then multiply it by 4, so just 4, and then divide it by 3, 1 over 3. And that should take care of it. So if we press Ctrl, Shift, and S, ooh, we get a lot of errors. Well, what happened here? Well, let's see. Unable to process the code. There is something expected near font size. So there's something going wrong near font size. Now, whenever you have an error, you're gonna have to fix it because your code won't run. Thankfully, you can click on Jump to Error, and it brings me to font size. Now, that's actually not exactly what's happening, and I don't really have the means here to really explain down in detail while these things are, but what actually is going wrong here is I needed to put a comma behind here, like there is everywhere else, because this is basically a Lua table, something I'll have to explain at some other point. But the syntax is incorrect. There needed to be a comma here like there is everywhere else. Unfortunately, when that error happens here, the text editor sends you to this line instead of this line. So whenever you get an error, try to fix it, but make sure to look for where it could actually be. It's not always exactly on the line that you might be looking at. Anyways, let's hope this works, because we're basically just hacking this at this point. And yeah, this is the old error. We don't have to worry about this one anymore, and there's no new error. So we go to Tabletop Simulator, and wow, that looks a lot better already. We now have the deal cards in the right size and height, and everything is looking a lot nicer. Maybe do a little bit about the scale about that box. So how about I make the scale something like this, and I like that background to be white instead of gray, because I think the gray is ugly. So 1, 1, 1 is white, and then yeah, 0, 0, 0, that's black. So Ctrl Shift S, and we'll go back into the room. And yeah, looks pretty good. It's just hovering a little high. And that's because I changed the position, so that Y value makes it go up. So if I put that back to 1, let's see if we can still find, yeah, the button, and looks pretty nice to me. It's hovering still a little bit high, but it's not something I'm gonna worry about right now. You guys can figure that out for yourselves. Anyways, I'm gonna right click it because I think that red is really bright. I'm just gonna make it black because that's my prerogative. And now I have a button that I can click with deal cards. Whenever I click it, random stuff happens here. Well, not really random. It's actually the code that's written here. As I was saying earlier, whatever you put in, whatever function you refer to in the deal in the click function area here, so deal cards, that's the function that will be ran. So all the code in here will happen when we click the button. And the code is basically printing. So whenever you write print, it will send information down here to the text field. So if I were to write instead of OBG, I would write hello world, and then Ctrl Shift S to save and send to Tabletop Simulator and go back into it. It will actually say hello world as the first line when I click the button. So now you did in hello world as well. You do need the quotation marks because the print function requires a string if you want to see it output like that. But again, it's some quirky stuff. There are tutorials on Lua out there that you can check if you want some more information about basic programming. But you can follow along with the examples that you see. And if you just follow the conventions, you'll probably get a lot of stuff done without really having to become an expert at it. All right, so I'm deleting all of that because I want to shuffle that deck of cards, right? Remember from the beginning? So how would we go about doing that? Well, In Tabletop Simulator, I'm gonna click on the deck of cards and I am going to go get that GUID. So under scripting GUID, just click on it. It'll copy it to the clipboard. And then in onLoad, I'm gonna write deck equals to that number. And yeah, that also needs to be in quotation marks, else it won't work because it has to be a string. So deck is the name of the variable. If you've never programmed before, a variable is pretty much like a box. It's a container in which you put information in. So in this case, we have a box and we are going to refer to that box as deck. And the information that we're going to put in there is the number of the GUID. Now, to make it a little bit clearer maybe, because with deck we might think that we're already referring to the objects while we're actually referring to the number that the object is used to identify itself with. So I'm going to change the name of the variable to deck underscore GUID, which is a little bit better to represent what's actually in there. Anyways, so now we have a variable and we have the information that we need that I told you earlier refers to that deck. So how can we shuffle the deck? Well, if we go into that deal cards function and we type deck GUID, which refers to the, if we type deck equals to, so now we're actually going to refer to the deck. And then we could write deck GUID, but that's just going to refer to that number while we actually want to refer to that object. So we're going to look to convert that GUID to the actual object. So we could go to the API again, but I'm going to show you another way to do it. And this time I'm just going to write get GUID and see what happens. And well, it didn't really come through, but I did see this thing, get object from GUID. Well, that sounds like what I want, right? So, okay, I'm just going to go click on that, I guess. So get object from GUID, and it already refers to deck GUID, so that's kind of neat. So my deck here, so this container will refer to the actual deck as it is in the room in Tabletop Simulator now, because this function will convert this number to the actual object. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, what can you do with that then? Well, I'm gonna write deck, and I want to shuffle that deck of cards. Let's see what happens. Deck dot shuffle, and it's already filling it in. So yeah, let's do that deck shuffle. So what we're doing here is we're running a built-in function of any kind of object in Tabletop Simulator. If you want more information about that, it's all explained in the API. But what I'm doing now is I am telling Tabletop Simulator, go grab that deck and then try to shuffle it. And well, we'll see if that works. Ctrl-Shift-S. All right. And if I click on the button now, the deck shuffled. And I can do this over and over and over again. Pretty neat. So the final thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to deal cards. So see if the same thing works. Deck, can we deal cards? Well, there is a deal thing, and it's asking for an int number string player hand index. Well, if you've ever programmed before, you probably know everything you need to know now. If you haven't though, I recommend, well, try to figure it out with the API. So just go in here, type deal, and you'll find the function, because all those functions are in here as well. And you can get more information. It says deals objects to hand zones. Oh, okay, that's kind of what we want. And then it says, well, int number actually is a number, and it refers to how many do you want to deal. String player color is, well, what player color do you want to deal to? That all kind of makes sense, right? So let's try this out. We're just gonna put some numbers in here. So deck deal, well, let's do 1. And let's see if that works. All right, pressing the button. Okay, nothing's happening because, well, I am still the black game master. So I'm gonna go sit in the red spot and press the button again. And whoop, I'm dealing cards to red now. Actually, I'm not just dealing cards to red. I'm probably dealing cards to all the players that are on the table because I'm not specifying any specific player. So yeah, we made a button. We're dealing cards now. For a final thing to do for this tutorial, what if I want to make another button that will take a card off the deck and place it next to it so that we can burn a card, deal a card, burn a card, you know, like you would in a game of poker or something. Pretty easy with the code we already have. You can just hover over the rectangle, Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, we make a copy. And what we have to do now is we have to go on games because we changed something in Tabletop Simulator. So we're gonna have to override our save game first. So click on override your tutorial and then double click it to load it again. so that it says loading complete. Then we can go back into our Atom editor, and we can press Ctrl-Shift-S, and it'll send the files, and it looks like it's lagging for a second. Okay, this is a little bit confusing, I guess, because I have two squares now with the same code and the same name. So that's not really what we want. So I'm going to make a quick change here. The first one, I'm going to change the name off. So I'm going to call this one Card Dealer. And I'm going to call this one Card Mover. Well, I call it Card Mover, but let's fix that really quickly. All right. Since I changed the names, I changed something in the room. So I'm going to override and I'm going to load. Whenever you do that, the good news is that Atom does give you a warning in case you mess that up. All right. So now that we've done this, if you look at the files here, the content for the top two files is still the same, but now there's one called Card Dealer and one called Card Mover so that you can differentiate between them. Really nice. So we're going to select Mover and we're going to make some quick changes. The beauty of this code is completely contained to that rectangle, so you don't have to change anything. There will be no conflicts, but you could hypothetically start changing things around. And for example, instead of deal cards, you're going to call this move cards. If you do that here, you have to do it down here as well. But for the sake of showing you that there's no conflicts, I'm going to leave it exactly the same. Then the label, I'm going to change that to move cards. And then everything else can be pretty much the same as far as I care right now. And we're going to do Ctrl-Shift-S to see if it works. And then in Tabletop Simulator, this one deals cards and this one deals cards as well, but no conflicts whatsoever so far. That's good. So what we're going to do now is we're not going to deal a card, but we're going to move a card. So how would you go about doing that? Well, you know, let's see if the English language is going to help us here as well. Let's do deck. We want to grab a card from the deck. So deck grab. No, nothing. Okay, how about deck? Let's take a card from the deck. Take object. Would that work? Who knows? I mean, I'm just messing with you guys, obviously. But yeah, take object. I think we'll do it. So if I do deck take object, and what I'm going to do for that actually is I'm going to delete it for now, and I'm going to go back to the API first and see what take object actually does and see if we can have some code for it, because it was asking for a table, not for a deck or something, so it might get confusing. And yeah, so take object takes an object from a container, a bag, a deck, or a stack of chips and places it in the world. So great, we found the function that we wanted, but oh gosh, this also needs a bunch of parameters and everything, and they even give us some helpful code. So let's just copy paste it and try to use it for our own personal gain here. So copy paste that in. First off, we don't need function onLoad, and that also means we don't need the end, because in case you haven't noticed, every function also needs an end at the very end, and there's code in between. So you'll get errors if you don't do that correctly. Then there's a second function that's called take callback and everything. Oh dear. Let's just get rid of that function, and we'll deal with that later if we actually have to. Right now, it doesn't really matter. Oh, actually, this code does call that function because it says take callback here. So, okay, that's fine. We can paste it down here, and we're just not going to worry about it, and we'll just put it at the end of the page. All right, so we are doing future name is taken from container, blah, 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 and it says self take object. Well, self means take an object from the rectangle, but we want to take an object from the deck. So let's replace self with deck. All right, and we're just going to save this thing. And hopefully it'll work, because I think we're about ready to end this tutorial. So let's click the first button, still working. Let's click the new button. It moved the card around. Pretty sweet. So anyways, just to wrap this up really quickly, if you've taken some programming classes, the API has a lot of information and you should be able to get through it pretty quickly. However, I am going to give you 7 more tips to help you along the way, and they're pretty short. So tip number 1, everything in Tabletop Simulator is open source. So if you get stuck and you don't know how to do something, go find a game that already does it, see how they did it. So I'll show you an example. If you go to any other game with some scripting in, I'm going to use my own mod for Dags of War, and you load it up. Dags of War has a ton of scripting. I mean, this is almost a video game. So if I open this room up and I open up add them, you'll see that none of the stuff that I was working on in the previous room is still there, because now it just loaded all the scripts for Dags of War. And I put everything for that mod in one long file in the global. There's no rectangles or something, it's just everything is coded in relation to the room itself. But I did anticipate that this would be a great way to teach somebody Tabletop Simulator, so I wrote a ton of comments in here. This is pretty much a full tutorial on Tabletop Simulator that you can just read through on how I put everything together and why I made certain choices left and right. I wrote this as I was learning Tabletop Simulator coding myself, so it's not perfect, but it will teach you a whole bunch of stuff, and oh my gosh, there are so many cool things that mod does. So by all means, have a look at that mod if you want to see how some stuff is put together in Tabletop Simulator, but alternatively, every mod with scripts you can just access in the same way. So tip number 2 then. Keep in mind that there's a difference between the objects and the containers in Tabletop Simulator. If you have a deck of cards, that deck of cards is actually a single object. There are no cards that are stacked on top of each other by any means. It's just one 3D model that represents the deck, and the animation is so fluid that you don't even notice when you're playing, but it is one object, and one of the variables that's attached to that object are all the cards that are inside there. But whenever you put a card in a deck, or you take a card off of a deck, a new object is created when you take one off, or an object is deleted when you put it on, and then the information of that object is just stored in a little variable. So keep that in mind. Whenever you're working with cards, whenever you take the second to last card out of a deck, all of a sudden the deck no longer exists and there's just one card left. Might be a little bit cryptic right now, but just keep it in mind. There's a big difference between containers and objects. Number 3, don't try to turn a Tabletop Simulator mod in a video game. It's dumb. It's Tabletop Simulator, and the people that play Tabletop Simulator want to play board games. The reason why the scripting is awesome is because you can speed things up and make things more efficient. But if you really try to turn it into a video game, you're going to end up with having to deal with so many quirks of Tabletop Simulator that you're way better off just opening Unreal Engine, Unity, GameMaker, whatever actual game engine, and just write the entire game in your engine. Tabletop Simulator is really quirky because it's not designed to do that. So number 4, this has nothing to do with Tabletop Simulator really, but it does apply here. I've taught a bunch of programming classes, and I've noticed that people who are kind of new to programming tend to just put a lot of code in the main loop. And in Tabletop Simulator, you do have that update loop that just runs every frame. You want to avoid putting code in there if you can. It's much better to just code things whenever a player interacts with something, and then just, for example, you press a button, something happens, or if they move something onto the board, whenever that thing reaches the board, you run your code. Don't do stuff where you're just checking if something went on the board every frame, because Tabletop Simulator is not built for that and it will get really slow. Number 5, in Tabletop Simulator, all your data are pretty much Lua tables. It's Lua's big data format. So if you want to learn how to do this, that is where I would start. Get a Lua tutorial, but first and foremost, look at how tables work. It saves you so much time if you get good at using tables. Number 6. So in the beginning of this video, I talked about the GMNotes, the third hidden field. There are not that many ways to assign information to the objects in Tabletop Simulator, so I would use that one as much as you can. You can get the information out of there pretty easily by using the get GMNotes and set GMNotes functions, and players can't really see them when they hover over it. They won't appear, so it's a very good way to get information and to identify certain objects in the room as well. So look into those things because they're really useful. Number 7, Tabletop Simulator is entirely based around JSON files, and we've already looked at that when we were looking at the save games. If you open up a JSON file with a text editor, you can change everything, change some values left and right, and things will be different in the engine. Now, the cool part of that is that with Lua, you can actually parse these JSON files as well. So it's pretty easy to just grab raw data from any object as a JSON object, and then you can just start messing with all sorts of stuff, even if there's no function for it in the API. So this is getting really to an expert level of editing. I actually had to do that at some point in the Dags of War mod. But you know, if you end up getting really excited about this, it's good to know from the very beginning that if there isn't a function to do something in the API, you can just make your own and parse a JSON file. And those are my 7 tips. So to wrap things up, I have 2 more things, and I'm going to be pretty brief about that. First off, if you Google for MrStump and Tabletop Simulator, you should be able to find this page. The URL is up here as well, but as you can see, it's pretty lengthy. You can also find it in the Tabletop Simulator Community Hub under the guides. And MrStump has made a whole bunch of tutorials for scripting Tabletop Simulator. They're actually pretty decent. They don't always get to the level where you need to be at if you're trying something complicated as the Dags of War game, but in general there's a lot of stuff there. He also has this room in Tabletop Simulator with 6 examples of things that you might have to do a whole bunch of times, like creating a timer, taking objects, spawning objects, finding objects, saving, loading, all that kind of stuff. So my advice for you, if you like this video, if you're like, dang, I'm gonna make my own Tabletop Simulator mod and script it, go do those tutorials of MrStump. They won't take you that much time to get through, and you'll build up a pretty solid foundation in Tabletop Simulator. Now, if that's what you end up doing and you get stuck, or if you feel like, well, I'm making a pretty cool mod and there's just something that I want to script, but this tutorial by Bob wasn't really in-depth enough for that, you can actually get help for this online pretty easily. All you have to do is go into the Tabletop Simulator Discord server. So there are 2 Discord servers that I use when I get stuck. The first one is the official Tabletop Simulator Discord server, which is literally called that. You should be able to find it pretty easily if you Google for it, but if you can't find it, let me know and I can invite you to it. And they have a channel under modding where they give you advice on scripting if you get stuck. It's just called scripting. It works pretty well. There is, however, an even better Discord server, in my opinion, for learning Tabletop Simulator scripting, and it's called TTS Club. And in TTS Club, there is also a modding section where they also have a scripting channel, and you will get information there really, really quickly. I've gotten stuck on a mod with something that I was trying to figure out that was pretty advanced stuff in Tabletop Simulator, and I got a reply in less than 15 minutes and my issue was resolved. So if you're working on something in Tabletop Simulator, those 2 Discord servers can really help you out, and they're very efficient. And that is pretty much everything that I wanted to share about scripting in Tabletop Simulator. Now, if you feel that this is all still very intimidating and well above your head because you've never really programmed before, that's fine. Thanks for watching the video and sticking with me until the end. If you got really excited about it and you want to make your own mod now and script it, I really recommend it. I love scripting in Tabletop Simulator. It is just so fun to make a board game run efficiently to me. I know, really geeky stuff, but maybe that's something you'd enjoy too. And you know, if this is something that you're like, well, I'm kind of in the middle, it still seems very intimidating, but it also looks very exciting, feel free to reach out because I'm more than happy to help you. And like I said, you can find plenty of help online as well in case you need it when I'm not around. So that's a wrap for this video. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.